Hey friends, Brendan here. Welcome back to The Crawl. So today I just wanted to come in here and chat about my favorite games of 2022. Okay, so normally I do like a whole big scripted thing for these videos, the couple times that I've done Game of the Year roundups on this channel so far. This year though, since I'm knee deep in so many other projects for this channel and elsewhere, I just figured it'd be fun to just come in here, kind of do a casual, unscripted chat with you guys about my favorite games of the year. I'd love to hear about your favorite games as well. There were of course some stuff that I didn't get to play this year. Signalis, probably the most important one, and Cult of the Lamb as well. Citizen Sleeper is another one that it looks awesome, but I just didn't have the time to, dedicate to it. And there were also a bunch of games that I liked this year that didn't quite make my top 10, and I want to really quickly just shout a few of those out, starting with Xenoblade Chronicles 3. So for a lot of people, this is maybe their favorite game of 2023, and I absolutely see why. For me, it just... It was really great for a really long time, up until, this is probably contrary to popular opinion on this game and its story, but up until Chapter 5, kind of went off the deep end for me. I wasn't really vibing with some of the story stuff in that. It just wasn't quite my style. I know a lot of people really love it though, and it's a really well-made game. It's a really well-crafted story, and I absolutely think it's totally deserving of all the accolades it got. And I played it almost entirely in first-person mode, which, it was kind of like a weird sci-fi wizardry, which was neat. So I like that. Some other notable mentions would be Little Gator Game, cool little short 3D platformer action-adventure game, kind of about a kid playing an imaginary game that's sort of like Zelda. That game really spoke to me and my nostalgia quite a lot, and I thought it was just really charming. Gundam Evolution, I haven't really been into a multiplayer shooter like this in a long time. I love Gundam and mecha, and so it really just... I don't know, it hit a lot of different ways for me this year. Phantasy Star Online 2 New Genesis on PS5. It came out last year, or 2 years ago now, I guess, 2021. But in 2022, it came to PlayStation 5, and that's where I played the bulk of it. I love Phantasy Star. I think it's probably like one of the best JRPG series. It's probably second to Dragon Quest for me in terms of like JRPG series. And Phantasy Star Online specifically was a huge gateway to me, like in multiplayer gaming and MMOs. But yeah, I don't know. It's not gonna, it's not gonna replace your Final Fantasy 14s or World of Warcrafts anytime soon. But it's a nice little online action RPG, and I had a lot of fun with it. Live Live was also really great. It's really cool that we finally got that game in English for the first time, officially for the first time. Really cool structure, great music. Karen's Crypt, a little 2D pixel art action adventure game. Looks like a Game Boy Color game. Played that on Switch this year. I really enjoyed it. I didn't quite beat that one, so that's why it's going in the honorable mentions, but I really had a fun time with it, and it's this fun little Zelda-ish Metroidvania with a fun, like, spooky undead twist to it. It's a charming little game. Infernax, great game. Little love letter to Zelda 2 and Simon's Quest. So like, the two black sheeps of the NES era Zelda and Castlevania games merged into one awesome, very gory, Berserk-esque 2D side-scroller action platformer Metroidvania word salad. I also think Bloodborne PSX deserves a shout out, made by Lilith Walther, an amazing solo indie dev. I know she worked with other people on this game, but man, what a faithful recreation of Bloodborne. I love Bloodborne. I obviously love, the PS1 aesthetic and stuff. This was such a cool little treat. It's only like Yharnam, the first area of Yharnam, so it only takes you like maybe an hour or two to beat the game. But the extra content and the way it wraps up feels like a complete and holistic experience despite the bite-sized nature of it. Speaking of FromSoft-inspired PS1-looking awesome RPGs, there are two, Lunacid and Dread Delusion, two retro 3D first-person dungeon crawler action RPGs that are inspired by Morrowind, Shadow Tower, and Kingsfield. They're both in early access, which is the only reason that they're on my honorable mentions and not in my top 10. I am just waiting to see what the final product is, because based on the early access impressions so far, these are going to be really, really special games. And I'm not just saying that because I interviewed these developers earlier this year, along with some other people who are making Kingsfield-inspired games. I really think that Lunacid and Dread Delusion are going beyond their inspirations in really interesting ways, and there are definitely types of games that I really want to cover more on this channel going forward. I also got to give a shout out to Pokemon Violet. I like Pokemon a lot. We're going to talk a little bit more about it soon. I just, Violet was fine. And I know people really didn't like it because of the performance and whatnot. That stuff never quite bothered me. In fact, I think like the last 5 hours of this game and some of the quest lines in this game are some of the best Pokemon's ever been. I admittedly don't have a lot of experience with the Pokemon series as a whole. I started with Gen 1 and really Gen 2 is where I really got into the series. And then I fell off for a long time and got back on with the Switch. So I've played like pretty much all of the mainline Pokemon games that have been on Switch, and Violet is certainly, I think, one of the best of that batch of the Switch games. I enjoyed playing it. I just, I don't know, it just didn't quite hit for me as much as another game we'll talk about soon. So anyway, with those brief honorable mentions out of the way, now we can finally get on to the list proper. Starting with number 10, Devilspire. Stop me if you heard this one. A first-person, roguelike dungeon crawler. Sounds pretty much like a game I would enjoy, right? So it's inspired by Kingsfield, go figure, and it has a lot of roguelike elements to it. So instead of exploring bespoke dungeons, you're going through a spire, climbing this tower, dungeon floor by dungeon floor, in randomly generated, well, I should say procedurally generated areas. There's different monsters to fight, gear to find. You go as long as you can until a trap or a monster or a boss inevitably ends your run. You start over and you take what you learned and some of the stuff that you unlocked, and you try to make progress, even further progress in the next run. This is another game by a developer that I interviewed over on GameSpot earlier this year, and I was just really taken with just how simple and well executed this little dungeon crawler was. If you like any sort of dungeon crawler, like say Kingsfield again, Shadow Tower, or if you're really into roguelikes of any type, you should definitely check out this game. Number 9, Soul Hackers 2. So I think this game got kind of a bad reputation this year. A lot of people were expecting it to be Shin Megami Tensei 6 or Persona 6. In reality, what Soul Hackers 2 is it's a Shin Megami Tensei dungeon RPG that's been modernized in some ways. So if you go in expecting maze floor dungeons, grinding a lot in relatively samey looking environments, optimizing your characters to get through the dungeon, man, this game's for you. I loved it. I thought it was a really good time. I think the music is excellent. The characters are actually really well developed. And, like I was saying, it's a dungeon RPG that's been modernized. So you're not going through it in first person, you're in third person. The camera's still pretty close to the main character's back, evoking that old school dungeon DRPG grid-based movement and camera, while being a little bit more accessible to people who maybe aren't used to that sort of gameplay. The battle system is streamlined. It's still very similar to the push turn system, but at the end of the battle, instead of you taking those extra turns, they're all kind of combined into one big attack that you do against your enemies. It's called the Sabbath system. I thought it worked really well. I know some people disagree with that, but in terms of like streamlining the Shin Megami Tensei experience, especially the old school Shin Megami Tensei experience, I think it does a great job of that. Don't let anyone tell you it was the worst RPG of 2022, because it absolutely was not. If you go with the right expectations and you know that this is a dungeon RPG first and foremost with, a little bit of social interactions and some modernized presentation, I think you'll have a good time. Because I certainly did. Okay, so number 8 really took me by surprise, and that's Sonic Frontiers. Sonic Frontiers is my first Sonic game ever. I've never owned a Sonic game, and I've really never played a Sonic game until Sonic Frontiers. So I know that there are people out there who were a little bit disappointed with it. There's some mixed opinions. There's people who absolutely love it, and there's people who don't like it as much. I've even seen some people go out and say it's, absolutely horrible. Some of my colleagues at Digital Trends called it the Balan Wonderworld of 2022. Now, I don't know if I totally agree with that statement, because I certainly had a hell of a time with this game. Thought it was so much fun. Just zooming around these environments, playing in these sandboxes, and understanding the mechanics, learning how Sonic moves, and then trying to just do cool stuff. and get places fast, you know? That's probably the whole thesis statement of Sonic in general. Get from one place to another doing fun, cool things as fast as possible. And that's totally what this game did for me, at least. In terms of the story, I don't know anything about it. I thought it was fine. But what really stuck out to me and what totally blew my mind, other than the gameplay, was the soundtrack. This is so good. And if I was going to give one game this year, like soundtrack of the year, I think it's Sonic. These boss tracks in particular, with the metalcore boss tracks. When I'm not playing, I listen to this soundtrack a lot. This is a game that's outside of my normal game playing diet, I guess you could say. And I also don't play a lot of 3D platformers, period. I've only played a handful of them in my entire life. This was a total novel and just fun experience to just do something that I'm not really normally used to doing in video games these days. And yeah, I had a good time with it. Turns out Sonic's cool. Who knew? So number 7, it's a bit of a cheat because it's actually not a new game. It's more of an expansion pack. And that would be Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. So I'm going to be really honest with you guys. I love Monster Hunter. I've been playing Monster Hunter since the first generation on the PSP. I have played almost every generational release since then. Those games I put, hundreds and hundreds of hours into those games, especially with Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate and World and Iceborne. Those are games I put thousands of hours in collectively, just between those 3 alone, not to mention the other games prior to that. Rise was an awesome game for me. I played so much of it, and I came away thinking that maybe I didn't like it quite as well as World, and after Sunbreak, I can say I definitely didn't like Sunbreak as much as I liked Iceborne. But that isn't to say that this game is bad or that I don't like it. It's just that I prefer what was in Iceborne and World. Hence why this is actually pretty low on my rankings, all things considered. I honestly thought that this would be like number 1 or 2, but after I played, for a few dozen hours, did some hunting with my friends, I just never felt compelled to really stay past to see a lot of that post-game stuff. Maybe if I had, this would be higher, but it wasn't quite there for me this year. That said, I'm still totally in love with Monster Hunter. I do really adore Rise, had a great time with Sunbreak, and I am just so stoked to see what comes out of Capcom next as far as the series goes. I can feel it. It feels like it's coming soon, and when it does, I know I'm going to lose another 1,000 hours to a huge Monster Hunter game. And I just can't wait. And this was a really good game to hold us over until then. Okay, number 6, kind of a weird one. Pokemon Legends Arceus. Again, like I said earlier with Violet, I am not a huge Pokemon guy. And the general gameplay structure of it, it's fun. I like it. I like RPGs, so of course I would gravitate to something that's built on that RPG formula, like the Pokemon series in general. But what Arceus did that I was so in love with was just the catching. I love being able to sneak up on a monster, pop a Pokeball, and then just catch them. And that little jingle that you get with the fireworks, it's just instant dopamine serotonin rush. It makes you feel so good. And I really love that this game really focuses on the catching and the research as the main loop, the main gameplay loop. That is how you get your current party of Pokemon. That's how you level them up. You're not grinding out battles against other monsters. You're actually catching, and that levels your party up. And to me, that was the one thing that if Violet and Scarlet had done that, had let you, catch Pokemon in that way and use that as a mechanic for leveling up your Pokemon, I would have vastly preferred that over the auto battling thing that they put in Scarlet and Violet instead. It's fine. It makes sense in Scarlet and Violet to do that, but I just loved walking through these open zones in Arceus and just catching Pokemon. The environments weren't the most exciting, and sure, they were pretty bland, and I liked the art direction, but that doesn't stop the fact that a lot of these zones were pretty empty. However, the reason that these areas were so enticing and exciting for me to explore isn't because I wasn't sure, what landmarks am I going to see? What sort of crazy side quests am I going to stumble on? It was literally just, what other Pokemon am I going to run into? And so it didn't matter that it wasn't the most exciting. I was excited to go explore because I knew that there were other weird hidden Pokemon out there that I hadn't seen yet. And I was just like continually excited to explore and see what I could find, see what I could catch. I found that more wild and open feeling of Arceus to be so compelling. So I hope that continues. And at the very least, if not, I would really like to see some of those mechanics, like the catching mechanic, make a full transition into the mainline games, whatever the next generation is called. That would be, to me, that would be the ultimate. Like Scarlet and Violet have a better world, I would say, structurally. But Arceus's gameplay really just was the next level for me. I mean, even the combat, I love the changes to the combat. I know that's a really divisive topic for a lot of folks, especially a lot of Pokemon diehards. But, as someone who's really not into the competitive scene, who's really more interested in just catching and collecting Pokemon than I am like fighting other people's teams or whatnot, I thought the new combat was really cool. It was a little bit more strategic, and it was a lot more dangerous. It really felt like, you were in danger out there. And that to me was such a great change up. So yeah, I hope we get stuff like that in the future from Pokemon, whether it be more Legends games, other spin-offs, and hopefully in the mainline series as well. Number 5 is another kind of cheat, because technically this game, even though this version of it came out in 2022, it's technically a remake of an older game, and that is Crisis Core Reunion. Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion is, I believe, or Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion. Yeah, that's it. Now, I am a huge fan of the original PSP version. I actually used to like Crisis Core better than the original Final Fantasy VII for a really long time. And then Final Fantasy VII Remake came out and kind of like elevated my opinion of the original Final Fantasy VII because I love that whole series. I really love the setting and world and characters of Final Fantasy VII. I was just never quite sold on the original game's gameplay. Over time, that's changed a little bit, and I definitely have a much higher regard of it than I did when I was younger, but a lot of that is because of games like Crisis Core, and because of characters like Zack. Crisis Core Reunion definitely has elements that feel like they're from a PSP game. The pacing of some of the missions, the story structure, the way that you can kind of just do these bite-sized side quests throughout the whole game. And at first, I wasn't fully gelling with it. But eventually, it really did click for me. And yeah, I just love Zack as a character so much. And it's so cool seeing this character who was such a mystery, yet so integral to the plot of Final Fantasy VII. And eventually, obviously, the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy. We'll see what happens with Rebirth later this year or next year. But Zack is awesome. His story is so wholesome and tragic and beautiful, and it's so cool to see that character and their story get such a big and important spotlight put on it. I'm not going to go into too much in depth because there are people out there who probably haven't played it, but I'm really glad they did this. And it's very obvious why. Zack is such an important character. So yeah, I think ultimately, at the end of the day, this game nailed it. It's a whole lot of fun. The new battle system is so good. Graphics are, for the most part, really good. And I loved getting to, re-experience Zack's story. And it just got me super hyped for more Final Fantasy VII. All right, now we're moving into the real controversial territory. So number 4 for me in 2022 was Elden Ring. Now, if you watched my first impressions video of the game, you'll know I had some real issues with the open world structure and some of the gameplay decisions that FromSoft went with for Elden Ring. And I'll be honest, those reservations remained consistent throughout the whole game, and in some ways just kind of compounded and got more intense as the game went on. I think this game would be more successful, or at least I would have a lot more fun with this game if it wasn't an open world game, or if the zones were a little bit more structured and the pathways through them more curated. I don't necessarily think that I want a hardcore dungeon crawler experience delivered in this way. And that's just me, right? As someone who loves Dark Souls and Shadow Tower and Kingsfield and Bloodborne and just all of that stuff, those are more of the gameplay structures that I want from a From Software game. And so obviously it's probably no surprise that in a lot of those instances, like that's where I had the most fun with Elden Ring, you know, in the legacy dungeons, in the side dungeons and all that content. That's where I found the most enjoyment with this game. You know, it's funny because I know a lot of people, they're confused as to why I didn't like Elden Ring's open world versus something like Breath of the Wild. And if you go watch my first impressions video, I give kind of a good indication as to why, but you know, there were some times where I absolutely did. And Mount Gelmir for me was like a huge eye-opening experience. I absolutely enjoyed that. The fact that they took away Torrent from you, it's a totally just inescapable maze. It's constantly just hitting you with hidden monsters and pathways that don't go anywhere or are way more deadly than what you're expecting. That to me was where I wish there was maybe a little bit more of that throughout the entire game and not just certain sections, but I have such complicated feelings on it. If nothing else, what I am so excited about with this game is that as someone who loves stuff like Wizardry, the older FromSoft stuff, the really old FromSoft stuff, it really excites me and warms my heart to see people embracing a game like Elden Ring, 13 million or however much sold, you know, in its first however many weeks. That is awesome, and I hope that it opens more people up to this world of, you know, really brutally hard, obtuse, but still fair RPGs, like I said, like Wizardry and Kingsfield and whatnot. From Software's games have been leading that charge ever since Demon's Souls really kind of broke out. And yeah, I'm excited to see what Elden Ring's success does for the industry and for, you know, hardcore RPGs and dungeon crawlers in general. Okay, so number 3 will probably shock some folks and probably upset some people that I put it above Elden Ring. But my number 3 is Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin. So this is a prequel of sorts to the original Final Fantasy, done by Team Ninja, the folks who did Nioh and Ninja Gaiden. And what it is if you don't know, it's a loot-driven, mission-based action RPG with slightly Souls-like combat. It's basically a Final Fantasy Nioh clone, if you played Nioh or Nioh 2. Now for me, someone who loves old school Final Fantasy, who loves Final Fantasy's job systems, who likes combing through tons of loot and messing with my character specs and all that stuff, I just adored pretty much every moment of this game. It's not as challenging as Nioh or even, you know, other Dark Souls style Souls-like games. Certainly not at all as difficult as that. In fact, it reminds me more of Impacing of like the original Phantasy Star Online, and there's more reasons that I'll get into in a second. But all of that great gameplay is also lifted up by its totally bonkers story. I know, you know, the developers say that they were trying to play it sincerely, but it feels like this was a joke, and it feels like they're in on the total absurdity of Jack, of this storyline, of this dude who listens to like new metal on his earbuds while he's beating people up. There's a whole reason for why Jack is such a total dweeb, and a total jerk, and how he fits into eventually the actual events of Final Fantasy 1. But anyway, there's 2 other reasons why I really, really like Final Fantasy Origin. And first is the music. The whole soundtrack is basically remix music from pre-existing Final Fantasy games done by Mizuta, who was the composer for Final Fantasy XI. Surprise! Something's related to Final Fantasy XI, and Brendan likes it. Who knew? Go figure. But he did an incredible job. And so all those tracks show up during the different dungeons in the game, and each dungeon or mission is based off of, even just loosely, a pre-existing Final Fantasy dungeon. So, you know, Final Fantasy X, you're going up Mount Gadgazet, however you say that. In 8, you're in the cave where you fight Ifrit. Final Fantasy XIV's is the dungeon, the pirate dungeon that I don't remember. Final Fantasy XI, you're in Kufum's Tower. In Final Fantasy XII, you're in Rampart's Tomb. And it was just so exciting. It was so much fun to be like, okay, where's this next dungeon going to be from? What's the music going to be? What are the little references? What monsters are going to be making an appearance from these games? And of course, the class system and the combat and all that stuff just made for this extremely fun, fast-paced game with a ridiculous story. But the real thing that really cemented this game for me as one of the best of the year is just being able to play it with friends or random folks online. The multiplayer mode of this game takes it from being a fun, really good, ridiculous 7 out of 10 to being, in my mind, an actually really great, exceptional game. I know I alluded to Phantasy Star Online a little bit earlier, and that is where it really hits for me. Running missions online with friends or random people over and over again in higher difficulty for better and better loot to take on more difficult bosses. That is the Phantasy Star Online loop, and that is the loop in Stranger of Paradise. So, I've spent a lot of time in this game doing that stuff with people. It totally pulled me away from Elden Ring. It pulled me away from so many other games. And yeah, this year, honestly, for a long time, this was going to be my game of the year if it wasn't for the next 2 games we're going to talk about. Speaking of which, let's get to number 2. Number 2 is Tunic. Tunic is obviously inspired by Zelda, and there's a sprinkling of Dark Souls in there too, but other games like Hyper Light Drifter, Hollow Knight, and Below, and Death's Door. And now these games are pretty popular right now, but the thing that sets Tunic apart is the manual system. Basically in this game, you're collecting manual pages, like pages of the manual you will get in a box. And so as you're picking up these pages, you're learning more about the game. And that's what the brilliant thing about Tunic is for me, is that this is a game that from the beginning of the game, so much of your moveset or the things that you can do, that you're allowed to do out in the world, is completely and immediately available to you. You just don't know it yet. And you can figure that out by, collecting these pages, or in my case, accidentally pressing a button, seeing your character do something completely unexpected, and then testing that on different areas of the game, and realizing that, oh my goodness, there's so much here to experiment with, to uncover, and to discover for yourself. This game is just constantly showing you something new and unexpected. And from the moment I started the game to the moment I ended the game, I was just absolutely enraptured in all those different mysteries and all those different discoveries. This is a game that's actually kind of hard for me to talk about because there's not a lot of story. It's a really just experiential game that you have to play for yourself to understand why it works so well. And there's a lot of really smart, novel design decisions that would sound so benign on paper, but when you experience it for yourself in the game, they're just mind-blowing. So if you have any interest in this game, if you like games like the ones I listed earlier, or you're at all like a Zelda or Souls-like fan, you should definitely play Tunic. And the thing that's great about Tunic is even if you're not interested in something that's super difficult or challenging, there's tons of accessibility and difficulty options in this game, so you can make the combat a lot more forgiving. You can make this game completely like more of just an exploration game. You don't have to even worry about as much of the combat. The good news is if you don't want to do that really heavy fighting, you can turn that stuff off or turn it down, and you're still going to have just as much of an amazing experience, because this is a game about exploration and discovery first and foremost. Everyone should play this game. It, for a long time, was absolutely my game of the year. I was on the Vigigame Apocalypse Game of the Year podcast talking about Elden Ring and Tunic, and in that I even said that Tunic was my game of the year. Until I played number 1. My favorite game of 2022 was Chained Echoes. So actually, part of the reason why I waited a while to do this video was because I had started up Chained Echoes. And I knew immediately that this was something special. Chained Echoes is a pixel art top-down RPG that looks like games that were on the Super Nintendo or even the PlayStation 1. And it is filled with so many Easter eggs and references and homages to games like Chrono Trigger and Xenogears and the entire Final Fantasy franchise. I mean, so many awesome, fun references for fans of those games. But the reason that I love this game is not because of its nostalgia, not because it's leaning into all these references. That stuff is fun, and it's, a fun little wink when you discover it. The reason that I love Chained Echoes, though, is because of how well crafted this is of an RPG. This was made by mostly one person, Marcus Linda, and the level of care and craft that went into this game is just so impressive. Chained Echoes has an absolutely excellent combat system, a class system, character progression systems. Exploring these worlds and maps is super fun. There's so many secrets. They're so well designed. You're constantly feeling like you're moving to the next place, even in the times where it opens up and becomes, really dependent on side quests or lets you just explore at your own pace. There's so many little carrots on sticks everywhere, and each and every one feels important and worthwhile, and they always lead you back to this main storyline that is just incredible. And there are set pieces and story moments and lore reveals about this world that literally had my jaw on the ground. I didn't think the game could keep surprising me, and it did up until the end. None of it feels out of place. It all fits so well together. And that's true of the storyline and the lore too. All the magic and the fantasy elements, they all fit so well together. Everything feels cohesive and internally consistent. There's just way more than I can say about a game like Xenoblade Chronicles 3 or even, certainly Stranger of Paradise and stuff like that I played this year. I'm tiptoeing around a lot of it because I really don't want to spoil anything, but it's just such a special game. It truly is. This is the first RPG in a long time where I felt compelled to do all of the major side content, and it was all worthwhile. And what really shocked me is I did it in 30-ish hours. Like, this isn't a 60-hour game. This isn't a 100-hour game. This is a 30 to 40-hour game. And that is something else that's worth praising and ties back into what I was saying earlier with how well-paced and well-structured this game is. If it had come out earlier in the year, it would have just completely topped so many best games of the year lists. It would have been absolutely considered for best RPG, in my opinion. It totally should have been. But of course, it came out in December, so not a lot of people played it. It is on Game Pass, so absolutely go check it out if you can. Really, the whole reason I made this video today was because I just needed to talk about Chained Echoes. So all those other games that I talked about, they were just, the preamble to being able to come in here and tell everybody, go play Chained Echoes. It's so good. It is so good. If you love RPGs of any style, from any time period, you need to play Chained Echoes. Those are my favorite games of 2022. I know it's a little bit rough. It was unscripted, probably not going to be too much editing because, like I said, I didn't have a lot of time to really dedicate to a whole full production for this video, but I still really appreciate it if you watched it to the end, and I'd love to hear about your favorite games of 2022, down in the comments and all that. But yeah, that's going to do it for me in this one. Thanks, as always, for watching. I hope you guys had a great 2022. I hope 2023 is off to an excellent start so far. I'll be back with more videos very soon. In the meantime, take care, and I'll see you in the next upload.